They told me crows were only birds, until the night they taught me how to listen. I remember the first sound like a physical thing, a slow, bone-dry clicking, as if someone ran fingernails along old pottery. It woke me in the gray hour when sleep still clung to my bones and the world smelled like cold iron and wet leaves. At the window, a smear of black against the dawn, 3 crows perched on the fence, heads cocked in perfect, unnatural unison. Their eyes were glass, their beaks clicked like the hinges of a coffin. I thought it poetic, then laughed at myself for being moved. That laugh tastes different now when I remember it, thin and foolish. My name is Thomas. I lived alone in the house on the edge of town, a squat thing made of dark brick and shadow, where the wind threaded itself through the warped window frames, and the kettle always seemed to whistle in the distance, even when it was cold. I worked nights, small repairs, locksmithing mostly, and spent afternoons reading by lamplight. The room where I sleep looks out over an orchard of dead trees, brittle trunks that scrape the sky like knuckled hands. The crows returned every dusk after that first morning, fatter and bolder, circling the roof like ink spilled across the sky. They began to show up in odd places, on the gutter, on the porch light, on the stoop where my shoes waited. Once, I found one perched on my chimney, tail feathers bristling, staring down the black throat of its own shadow. At first, the oddities were small, a thud on the roof at 3 in the morning, footprints in the frost that stopped at the threshold as if someone had forgotten to cross, a single feather left on my pillow. But the house started to change. Sounds came from corners that had no right to hold sound, a wet rasping, soft as cloth being torn, and beneath it a whispering like old newsprint. I would lie awake and feel the temperature in the room drop in tiny, deliberate steps, like someone walking away with the heat when I wasn't looking. The smell grew too. Not rot exactly, but an earthy sweetness undercut with iron, like a cellar where something had been buried last week and last year at once. I told myself I was imagining it. Isolation does strange arithmetic to the mind. It turns every creak into conspiracy. But there are moments you can't account for with tired explanations. One night, I woke to find a circle of small black stones on the floor beside my bed. No, not stones, the eyes of the crows. I touched one and my fingers left prints of ash. My throat closed then, suddenly and without warning, as if someone had pressed a cold palm to my Adam's apple. The room held its breath. Outside, the birds began to chant, a hollow chorus that matched the beating under my ribs. I should have left. I did not. They started bringing things. At first it was small, a scrap of ribbon, a bent coin, a rusted washer, all the sort of rubbish that gathers on the road. I told myself it was their nest building, that the birds were clever thieves. But then they began to bring metal, a dozen tiny keys, each one blackened as if forged in a coal pit, each one different. They left them in a neat row on my kitchen table, tipped against the salt jar like trophies. I recognized some shapes from my own workbench. Other keys were of designs I'd never seen, teeth cut in impossible angles. When I picked one up, my fingers prickled, as if tiny needles ran along the pad of my skin. The taste of iron bloomed across my tongue. The keys did something to the house. Doors I'd never noticed before appeared in the walls, thin seams that tasted of smoke and old bread. And when I tested a key in one of them, the lock didn't resist, it breathed. Behind that seam there was not a room, but a dark corridor that smelled like wet ash. Once I turned that key, sounds changed. The radiator's rattle became a low-throated croaking. The pipes hummed like a chorus of swallowed birds. I told myself to stop, to burn the keys, but they multiplied on the table, and sometimes I woke to find a key under my pillow, cold against the base of my skull. The crows learned to speak in fragments. At first, they mimicked the wind, then my name. I foolishly thought of parrots and tricks until a voice, my brother's voice, a voice I hadn't heard since he left, called from the yard in a tone made of gravel. I followed it to the shed and found nothing but feathers and an old photograph pinned to the door with a black wingtip. Me, as a child, grinning beside our mother, her face scratched out with ink. My stomach went hollow and the world narrowed to the sound of wings beating inside my ribs. Sleep thinned. I found myself losing hours, stepping outside into twilight that I had no memory of entering. My hands would be smeared with clay or with something darker. Strangers' voices would echo in the hallway and vanish when I chased them. The mirror began to betray me, not with a different face, but with small differences. A feather in the hair I didn't remember, a thin crack that spidered from the corner of my left eye like dried glue. Once, pressed to the glass, I watched from inside the mirror as a crow landed on my shoulder in my reflection, beak pointed like an accusing finger at a door I could not see in the room behind me. Neighbors stopped asking after me. When I mentioned the birds, they shifted and smiled with the practiced sympathy you offer an old man who speaks of ghosts. Crows, they said, they love to gather. But the CCTV I mounted to prove I wasn't mad showed only blackness where the yard should be. And for one brief, grainy second, the feed captured a hooded silhouette moving across the lawn, not on 2 feet, but gliding, wings tucked, carrying something heavy that rattled like 1,000 keys. When I found the first of the nests in the attic, a bundle of twists and wire and human hair wrapped around a small skull with my initials carved into its crown, the world finally gave me a line of choice. Leave the house and never look back, or turn another key. My hands shook, and the keys on the table seemed to shimmer. The birds outside began to chant in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I moved toward the table because I could not move, because the house had begun to shape me into something it wanted to keep. I set the smallest key into the bowl of my palm and felt it thrum, not unlike a trapped insect. The metal was warm as a tongue. Around me, the house leaned closer, its timbers listening. The birds kept time on the roof with a dry, deliberate ticking. I could smell the attic, dust and rosemary and the coppery ghost of blood, and the photograph with my mother's scratched-out face seemed to breathe in the dim. My hands did not stop. That is the honest part. I did not think. I followed the movement that had been made for me, like a river following the fault line of the earth. The seam I had found earlier waited in the dining room wall, a thin black mouth that tasted of smoke. The key slipped into the lock as if it had been carved for that exact tooth. When I turned it, the metal sighed, and the house answered with a sound like 1,000 pages flipping at once. The door did not open into a room, but into a gallery of impossible doors. Hundreds, maybe thousands, each set into a wall of bone-white doors that smelled faintly of rain and iron. Names were scratched into their frames in a handwriting that was mine and not mine. Thomas, M, mother, brother. For a breath, I thought I had found a way to lock everything away, to close the lids on whatever it was that had been creeping at the edges of my life. Instead, I found that the keys were not for locking doors, but for unlocking what had been hidden inside me. I turned a key at random. The door behind it opened onto a kitchen I knew from childhood. Sunlight like honey on the table, my mother humming with a kettle on the stove. The joy was a thin glass I lifted and drank. Then the glass shattered. The smell of iron rolled in, and my reflection in the window was not my own. A boy with my cheekbones, eyes full of the same thin laugh, holding a shard of something that shone like bone. I remembered being small and angry, and how accidents have a way of getting dressed up as calls to action. The memory collapsed and the door snapped shut, leaving me with a taste of old bread and a tongue that remembered salt. With each key I turned, the gallery grew louder, an argument, a laughter that became a sob, a door that revealed the shed where feathers had been pinned to old photographs. The worst thing was the mercy of memory. It made everything precise. I watched myself in those opened rooms, and each time I did, I understood a little more about why the birds had come. Not as messengers, but as keepers. They were gathering what I had left unburied, my silence, my excuses, the places I'd pried open and then walked away from. They were terrible and patient, making me into something that could hold them. At the end of the gallery, there was a single door with no name. When I opened it, I did not enter a room. I entered myself. There was the hooded shape, not moving, but already worn into my bones, a face like ravens' beaks, and skin like old leather, and within its chest a hollow where keys hung like ribs. It turned toward me, and for the first time I heard not voices from outside, but my own, small and exact and terrible, saying, "You kept the keys." I placed my hand against the hooded chest because I could not do it, and fingers that had once been mine sank into the hollow and found teeth of metal. They were cold. They fit like promises. The birds outside rose with a sound like pages being closed. The last thing I saw before the light went thin was my reflection in the glass of a door. A man with a feather caught behind his ear, smiling in the terrible way of someone who has finally remembered how to listen. There is a crow inside me.
subscribe to Horror Story Bar.